Welcome back. Tonight, President Trump has threatened to shut down the U.S.-Mexico border permanently.
That's after clashes Sunday between Border Patrol agents and migrants trying to enter illegally. Border agents fired tear gas and they shut down the busiest port of entry at the California-Mexico border. So what happens if an American gets stuck in Mexico when the border closes?
Our border reporter Oscar Margain is asking that question at a crossing here in Texas.
Due to the current situation, the San Antonio port of entry is now closed.
It was the scenario border agents had been training for since the migrant caravan began making its way through Mexico. All in formation, ready to repel a group of migrants who split off from a peaceful protest in Tijuana Sunday and made it past the Mexican blockade near the San Ysidro, California port of entry.
All pedestrians requested to be processed need to relocate.
The busiest port in the country shut down, with potentially hundreds of legal crossers, including U.S. citizens, turned away and told to go to another port. The president taking to Twitter Monday, threatening to shut down the border permanently.
And that's something that would worry me and probably give my mom a heart attack.
In Texas, hundreds of legal travelers use this international bridge in Progreso to go back and forth between Mexico and the U.S., including U.S. citizens and permanent residents. They simply park their cars next to the bridge and walk across.
You guys go through.
Humberto Salinas uses this bridge at least once a week. The possibility of having it shut down and getting stuck in Mexico is something he never thought about.
If it would be more than a week, I would not be able to survive.
We heard that he might close it down.
Iowans Daryl and Kendra Stalzer often come to Progreso to buy affordable medication and see a dentist. They, like many others, depend on the port to remain open.
It would be bad. It'd be bad for the economy of Progreso. It would be bad for the
love
people.
Coming here.
The events in California prove that the possibility of shutting down a port of entry such as Progreso is very real. So we wanted to find out what sort of guidance Customs and Border Protection has for U.S. citizens, residents, and legal travelers. CBP says to download their phone app or follow their Twitter accounts for updates on delays and port closures, but had no further instructions for people on what to do or how to get to another port safely.
Once you cross a point of over there, it is dangerous.
In Progreso, on the Texas-Mexico border, I'm Oscar Margain reporting.